Hello and welcome
Yeah.
to the
Yep.
Southwest Alliance Technical Assistance Center Barriers in Professional Employment and What to Watch Out For. Southwest Alliance
Oh,
Technical Assistance Center project was funded by the Administration on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. Today we're going to hear about barriers in professional employment and what to watch out for by Daniel Ekman, Amira Rashid, and Adam Shan.
okay. So welcome everybody. So you're going to hear us kind of switch off. We're going to mix in the issues we're going to be talking about with examples. So here are four topics we're going to be talking about. The first thing we're going to talk about is the employment rate in general for people with disabilities. And we're going to do that just to give people an idea of where we're at and to give you some background. Then we're going to talk about specific issues that are facing people with disabilities with degrees or even professional experience. And then we're going to move away from statistics a little bit to talk about some specific things that we've seen in the workplace. Now, these include structural barriers to professional employment. So, and this is at all levels, whether it's at the point where we're applying for a job or even when you're in a job. And then we're going to talk about attitudinal barriers to professional employment. And basically what that means is just barriers from other employees that we might see, attitudes that people have about employees with disabilities. So without further ado, we'll get started. Next slide, please. So we call this one simply falling short, the employment rate for people with disabilities. 17.4% of people with a disability were employed in 2013 compared to 64.6% of people without a disability according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So obviously, the context is that the employment numbers are very low for people with disabilities compared to people without disabilities. There's a huge discrepancy. And next slide. So another thing we looked at, as we said, we didn't just want to know what the unemployment rate is, but we want to know what the employment rate is. How many people are actually working? Because sometimes those numbers can vary a little bit. Well, you'll see the same discrepancy here. As of May 2015, which is as recent as we could find as far as statistics, 19.8% of people with disabilities were working. That's compared to 68.8% of people without disabilities. So again, whether you measure it by how many people are working or aren't working, you have this same gap in employment. Next slide. So we wanted to give kind of a deeper look into statistics because I think just looking at employment and unemployment doesn't tell the whole story. So one of the things we looked at was underemployment because that, as we've seen, whether it's with below minimum wage jobs or even part-time work, we've seen a lot of underemployment. So we're looking at the statistics a little bit. So in 2014, and this is according to Department of Labor, 33% of workers with a disability were employed part-time compared to 18% of those with no disability. And the reasons that we found that were given were that people's hours have been cut back or they were unable to find a full-time job. So in other words, the indication is that they could work more hours or they could work more if they had a choice in it, but for some reason either their hours had been cut or they were unable to find full-time jobs, which meant they were going into part-time work.
And I also think it's partly the attitude of the employment. Employers, either they think negatively about people with disabilities that they can't necessarily perform the job to the fullest potential, or that they would have to provide more ADA accessibility, whether it's physical or any type of accommodation in the workplace. to add to Amir's point, I would totally agree with that because like I said before, just for example, I am going over to parents reaching out, and Daniel can tell you when people found out it was a full-time position, people were like, oh, you're only going to be able to work 25 to 30, and I said, no, I want to work at least 32, if not the full 40. So my point is that people still want to put barriers on it. And I think Daniel could make a good point about that as well, about how hard it is to go through all these different steps and how many barriers people actually want to put in front of you no matter what your disability is to get a full-time job.
And those are things you'll see in the upcoming slides that we'll be talking about in some more depth, and we'll have some very specific cases. So next slide, please. So another thing that's interesting is there's always a talk about the quality of jobs people get. And what Amir and Adam talked about also factors into this quite a bit too. According to the Department of Labor, workers with a disability were more likely to work, or were more likely, than those with no disability to work in the production, transportation, and material moving occupations. 15% of people with disabilities compared to 12%. What that is, that's the service industry. So basically, food, I think the nickname for it that I've heard before is food, filth, and just kind of sub-minimum wage service jobs. Next slide, you'll kind of see the difference when it comes to professional occupations. So when you're looking into things like professional occupations or maybe higher paying jobs, let's say management or related occupations, workers with a disability are less likely to work in management, professional, and related fields. You're looking at 31% of people with disabilities compared with 39% of people without disabilities. So again, if you combine that with the big gap in terms of the employment and unemployment and underemployment, it paints a picture that people with disabilities are also in many cases being kind of shuffled into, I want to say, shuffled into lower ability, lower wage jobs than maybe they should be. I don't know if either of you have experience. Adam, do you want to talk about your job you started with and how you ended up there? The adult job?
How I started this was when I first started it was kind of like, I think of it as a pity job because yes, I had to go to work, but they said, oh, here's the job, you make a lot of tips. They made it seem more glamorous than it actually turned out to be. In the end, the tips were okay, but in the end, they ended up paying me about $2.16 an hour, and what I ended up having to do instead of that, how I ended up here at CSA is I ended up resigning, and I told the employer basically, I said, you either give me minimum wage or I'm leaving. And those days said, well, we just can't do that. So what I was able to do is to not make it eventual positive for everybody else, because now at that job now they make minimum wage with everyone should be regardless of your disability or barriers or challenges in your life.
So how did you end up at Adelante? Was that through school or was that through somebody else?
How it came about was I was looking for a job, and I don't want to say at that time was handling my, what they call home-based provider. At least it was called that back then. They changed the name a billion times. And I told somebody today that I really needed a job, to make a living. And so that's how I ended up there. Um, I ended up doing that for about 5 to 7 years, give or take. Um, and, but the thing was, they kind of saw people very shortly because, like I said before, they make it seem more interesting than it actually is. And still, even though people are making around minimum wage and jobs like that, in my opinion, they're still being underrated and mistreated.
So can we go to the next slide? So here's an interesting one we looked into too. So we said, well, what if you have a degree? Does that make a difference? We heard Adam's story that with if you have a service provider that also has, let's say, sub-minimum wage jobs, sometimes they'll try to take someone who's getting their services and tell them, oh, well, this job's really wonderful. Take this job without telling them, hey, this is below minimum wage or this is a service job. So does having a degree or more qualifications change statistics? Because we said, well, if someone has a degree, does that change anything? Unfortunately, what we found was that it seems not only does it not get better, but in some ways you could argue maybe it even gets worse. Because if you look at the unemployment rates among the different categories, if someone has less than a high school education, it's really bad. You have 7.9% of people with disabilities that get employed. You have over 50% of people, 51.5% of people without disabilities that are employed. So that's a huge gap. So you would think, okay, with a degree that might go away. So you'll see that the numbers go up. They go up in terms of employment. So, for example, if you take some college, 21.3% of people with disabilities are employed. Now, you might think that's good until you realize that that number goes up to 69.5% of people without disabilities. And even if you have a bachelor's or above, you have 26.1% of people with disabilities that are employed versus 79.5% of people without disabilities. So you still have a huge gap even with a bachelor's degree. So, and we have a question here, how many hours Adam worked? He actually worked 20 hours a week, I believe.
At the mall?
Yeah, at the mall. Did you know 20 or 10?
In the beginning it was 10 and then it was 15. Not what I was bringing home was around 150 or 160 every 2 weeks. At the end of the beginning, I was bringing home maybe like 90.
Okay, so you were,
and I'm being,
so per week you were making about 90? 90 to 100? Or 2 weeks you were making?
2 weeks.
$90 every 2 weeks. And I'm also typing the answer in here, so it's about 10 to 15 hours a week and about $90 every 2 weeks was the take-home pay to answer that question. And the interesting thing is he would have fallen into the high school category. So 14.3% of people are employed, but as Adam said, that means employed in anything, versus 62.5% of people without disabilities employed. So even with that, and Amir, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about this Because you have a bachelor's degree. What's it been like? Where have you seen this kind of affect you?
So I graduated with a bachelor's degree in 2009, and I continuously looked for employment for a year and a half before I found at least something. I really, it wasn't really my degree realm of degrees, but somebody, a close friend of mine, his father-in-law, referred me to the Arc of New Mexico, and I went in to the Arc, and they offered me a part-time position as a trainer, and what that entails is train agency staff on people with disability and their barriers, and kind of co-facilitate training in state training in the classes.
And they were asking, what was your degree in?
My degree, I have 2 degrees. My degrees are in psychology and chemistry. And so it was very part-time, where I may have started off 10 hours a week, and by the end of the year, year and a half that I was just a regular trainer, I was doing maybe 40 hours a week, making $15 an hour as a contractor. So it wasn't bad. And then they asked me, they saw my potential and how hard I was working. So they asked me to move up to a senior self-advocate trainer. And with that, my job duties increased, and I continued to do that for a year and a half, and then they asked me to do, or I applied to be the part-time self-advocate program assistant, and then I was working about 40 hours every 2 weeks, but making a little bit more money. And then I applied for the program coordinator, and I've been doing that for the last year.
So some of the things that we're going to get into, too, are some of the barriers that we found in employment as well. Next slide, please. So one of the things, obviously, that this indicates, and one of the things that you'll find in a lot of statistics, is an obvious educational inequality. And we have, if people want us to, we actually can send some statistics that we found. We had a much longer presentation when we started with more statistics. So one of the things we found is there's just a lack of educational inequality, and there's a lot of reasons for that. There's a lack of self-advocacy skills that are taught. Active participation in education is not only not taught, but in some places even discouraged. The curriculum's inadequate. Supports and services just are inadequate, or they're not there, or they're kind of partially there, but they're not adequate for what's needed, and the assessment tools aren't adequate. So basically, in all ways, the support's just inadequate. It's not there, and if you read studies, you'll see that these are some of the major reasons why the statistics are so bad in educational inequality. Next slide, please. So again, even at the university level, one of the things that we found was even there, statistics were bad. The statistics were bad not just for people getting in, but even for retention. Those statistics weren't very good. The dropout rate was worse for people with disabilities. The graduation rates were worse. So the studies that we read, some of the factors included lack of training among academic and support professionals. Just training's not there. A lack of support system, or one thing that they pointed out is there's not even minimal standards in terms of support system. That a lot of times the standards aren't outlined at all, and there's a lack of continuum of services, so it's very spotty. You get kind of services here or there, but you don't get a lot of, it's not a system, it's more of just ad hoc. When someone needs it, if we can give it to you, we'll give it to you. Do you guys, Amira has something she wants to add to this?
No, Daniel, can you give an example of your experience?
So my experience is a little bit of an odd one because I didn't necessarily use a lot of university support services, but I know actually in case, Adam, do you want to talk about what you went through at C&M? Because that was actually an example of where you kind of had to come up with your own support system as opposed to having one in place. What did they tell you had to do when you went there? And C&M is like a 2-year college.
When I went there, they wanted to give me this note taker, and I needed like one-on-one full support. So what I did is I actually have my brother. He went with me to college, basically for a while, and what ended up happening, it worked out well for a while, but because I had to bring in my own support, what ended up happening is that person, my brother, he ended up getting comfortable, I would say, and not wanting to help me stay on task. So what ended up happening is I ended up having to leave after a couple years because there's no one-on-one aid like there is in high school, which in some cases I believe that there should be, because if there was, I think people like myself would have been a lot more successful, if you will. And I want to share my experience too.
So we have Cynthia here as well, and she actually went to college as well, so she has an experience she'd like to share.
When I first moved to Arizona back in New York, I was trying to go to college, and they wouldn't accept they wouldn't accept my experience. They wouldn't accept certain information I got from New York, and they wanted my school records from, well, elementary school, junior high, and high school, and they wanted my medical records at one of the colleges. And once I mentioned that I have a disability and my medical condition and all that, and they wanted more information. They want me to send on my school records and my medical records about my medical history before I go to college, and I'm like, that's ridiculous. When I went to an appointment, that was a long time ago. This is like 25 years ago, and hopefully things change then. That's ridiculous to have somebody send medical records and school records from another state. It's crazy. My experience was quite the contrary. I went to the University of New Mexico, and I used the special services at the university, and they provided me with a note-taker for my classes, proctor, and books on my textbooks on TV, and they that's how I got through my 2 degrees and was successful in going to school.
And one interesting thing I also was thinking about, a story I heard from a couple of people in their 30s, was they said that they could get accommodations, but sometimes the professor would not provide them for them, and they would just refuse. And they would say things like, well, you won't get it in the workplace, so we're not going to give it to you here, or it's going to affect you in, this will somehow affect your work negatively. So again, it's an issue of standards where sometimes, even if there's a law, the standards are different depending on where you go and even what professors you get. And obviously that affects employment, because if you can't get the education, then how do you get into the professional field? Next slide, please. So again, they talk about things like cost, time. These are just some other factors, and the social security system can even be barriers. The National Council on Disability, I think, had a great quote that sums it up. The various systems feature limited resources, inconsistent terminology, disconnected agencies, inconsistent laws, and conflicting eligibility requirements. So in other words, there's the lack of, like we said, a lack of basic standards, or lack of even compatibility of different systems can make it very, very difficult in a university system. Next slide. So now we're going to get a little bit more into some of the workplace issues. So this one deals with applications, and we titled it The Shift to Online Applications. So some people might say, well, why are online applications such a big barrier, or why could they be? Well, online applications require a high degree of computer literacy and can even be difficult to fill out for those with computer experience. I could share my experience of having to fill out online applications for the state of New Mexico, for example. The applications are very, very tedious and long, and they're very difficult to fill out. And I'm someone who has a lot of computer skills, but I find them very difficult. You have to know how to attach documents. You have to be able to double check it. If your internet connection isn't great, then you could end up typing something in and all of a sudden it goes away. You have to have a computer that's working great. So in other words, you might already be behind if your internet access isn't great. It requires a lot of time to complete the application. I think it took me around 3 hours, which for a lot of people is just way too long. Even for me, it felt like it was too long. Next slide, because I want to see if there's something else we address in the next slide. Oh, and here's some other things that we noted. There's time limits sometimes that are placed on finishing the application. So what that does is it punishes people who would take more time to complete the application. So instead of being able to sit down with a paper application, take as much time as you need, and then work on a little bit to get it to someone, with an online application, sometimes you have a lot more time constraints. There's a lot of information and documentation that you need, and it's not just having it, but knowing how to get it online can be very difficult, because you have to know how to scan things in, you have to have access to that equipment, you have to be able to figure out how to get all that documentation to them, which, if you think about something like transcripts, doing an online application and then trying to send them in something by paper can be very confusing. The other thing, and this is the point I think that can be overlooked a lot, it is designed to make people answer the information the same way with different questions. So in some ways, it becomes a test of how well can you put in the answer that will get the computer to recognize that you have a skill. So it almost becomes more of a test of what wording you use to answer a question, as opposed to a test of how qualified someone is. An example of this is there's times where I've applied to positions that are maybe a slightly higher level, And when I'm told about where I land on a list, I tend to land very low, whereas there's other people that I find out have less qualifications that land much higher. And what somebody told me that has experience in state government is this, because a lot of the answers, they're looking for keywords or key phrases. And they're basically, the computer is looking at those, and by looking at how many times a key phrase is used or how many times it shows up in a resume, that determines what the list is. And if you're not in the top 15, based on that computer, you don't even have a chance to get an interview. So it weeds people out that don't have this literacy with either online applications, or maybe they have the literacy, but they answer questions slightly differently. That actually weeds out people, and it encourages much more conforming to what they want, as opposed to really giving people a chance to show their individual talents, skills, and what they have. Next slide, please. The other thing that about applications, and this isn't really specific to online, this is just an issue with all the factors. When you think about the inequality in education and how that leads to worse outcomes, both before, post-secondary, and after, that makes that can make it difficult to find employment. Why is that? Well, if you think about professional jobs, the ones that I've seen, and we've all here applied for many, all of them have very specific educational and experience requirements, which people often don't have. So the system, what it means is that if you're not taking a service job, if you're looking for more of a career type job where you can advance and where you can start somewhere but stay within the same company and move up, it favors people who either already have employment experience, which, as we know from the statistics, people without disabilities are much more likely to have that experience, or it favors people that have a higher level of education, which, again, if you look at the statistics, people without disabilities tend to have higher income. So all that factors into a system where people without that cultural capital, or basically people that don't have the higher level of education or already have employment experience, they kind of get weeded out of some of these jobs, even if they might be able to do them, or might even be able to do them better. Because if people are already experienced or already in the system, the state government works a lot like that. If you're in the system for a year, then you pretty much stay in the system. You're able to be employed. It's much easier to transfer. It's much easier to find jobs. But if you're someone outside of that system, it's very difficult to find a job. And that is not specific to disabilities, but I think that's what it can feel like for a lot of people with disabilities. They can feel shut out because maybe they have everything except for one little degree requirement or a small experience issue, and that can make the difference. Next slide, please.
And as for me, in my 2 degrees, that's what I'm lacking is experience. You know, that's why I have a qualification as a degree, especially going back for my master's, but I don't have the experience in the fields that I have my degrees in. And going back to, you know, the applications online, from my issues is my disparity issues, that if I don't have my voice activation computer hooked up, you know, my mobility, my finger mobility and my hand mobility is not very good, so that can be an issue for a lot of people with disabilities.
And that's a great point, I think, because there's a lot of disabilities where it almost excludes you just on what they require you to do. So next slide, please. So I kind of already went over this a little bit. In fact, I went over most of these points, but just to go over them quickly again, online applications have formulas and keywords and searches for them in the application. And I've already mentioned the one case, which is state government. If you don't get on that list of the top 15 people based on a computer formula, you're out. You don't even get a chance to move on to the interview stage. So it takes away opportunities for individuals to be seen, because again, if you get in front of the employer, you get it gives you a better chance, and at least then you can show them what you can do. And you don't get a chance to show them how your skill set might fit better. So as I put it, it becomes a contest of who could better fit into the application system rather than who is truly best fit for a job. It's kind of how standardized testing turns learning into how can you, it rewards one way of learning and punishes all others. In some ways, that's what the online applications end up doing.
Really quickly, because we want to get through this, but the accidental point, when I first applied for my job at the New Mexico Center for Self-Advocacy, it took me on, even though I had the qualifications, it took me like 5 or 6 times to even make the top 15 or the top 10, let alone the top 5, because like Daniel said, there's keywords, and I can tell you from experience, it's very discouraging, because you have the capability of doing the job. It's very discouraging when you're not even in the top 15 when you should be up there.
So as Adam was pointing out, and this has happened, and there's even one case I remember where they had put a position online, and 22 people applied, and nobody was qualified for it. And people were qualified, it's just the computer didn't think so. So again, a computer it's not really the best replacement. It's not necessarily any more objective than having a person. Next slide, please. And you'll see I'm also typing in information. Another thing that resource limits, these are a lot of fun. So, for example, in New Mexico, the resource limit within the system is $2,199 a month, and we added, or so some people say, because sometimes even asking a question like that, you don't get a single answer. So while there are programs that address this, it doesn't change the fact that many services can be lost if this resource limit is exceeded due to the loss of the DD waiver in New Mexico. Next slide, please. I just want to see if it addresses any other important things. So there's a lack of consistent answers from people in the system about even the resource limit, and the programs that are designed to help people get around the resource limit and get in the workplace can be poorly promoted. Let's just say a lot of people don't even know they exist, and this is not just people that are coming in for the first time. This is people that are already in the disability community that know a lot about these systems, but sometimes these programs are either hidden, or you'll get conflicting answers about can you use the program to get around the resource limit or not. Next slide, please. So complications with someone with more intensive support needs. And then I want to let Adam kind of talk about the resource limit and this, because they tie together in his case, a lot. So if a service system wants to cut back on job coaching hours, then it could be hard to find a job coach that will be able to provide support for all the needed hours, which means someone has to find friend help as opposed to professional assistance. And Adam has a really good example of this through his what he's had to do for his current job and also with job coaching as well.
My current job, current just for today, I've had to get Daniel's help as a friend, because a lot of times when your primary job coach or support person doesn't make it, in my case, the company I'm with will tell me, oh, we can't get nobody. Well, when you have any kind of job, as we all know, we can't get nobody. It's not a good answer to tell your boss So what I've had to do is like get Daniel's help as a friend a lot, which I'm really appreciative of that. But going forward into my new job starting tomorrow, what I'm actually having to do because is split my current person that works with me. He's gonna do a couple days, and then we're gonna bring another person up that's gonna do another couple days. But the thing they don't tell you is, like for that new person we brought on, Kristen and myself, that's my current friend and job coach right now. We were told that I can do all 40 hours, but what it turns out he really can't because he's got school and he's brand new to the field, which means he's also nervous, and one of the first things he has question my current job coach is, can we split it? I don't know if I can handle this order. And let me tell you, when you're starting out in a new job where you have to work 32 to 40 hours, like whatever, that's not something you need to hear or want to hear. And it's very discouraging. As of right now, I have to sit down with my employer tomorrow as far as the resource limit and tell her how many hours I can actually work without going over. And to be honest with you, at this point, and I start my job tomorrow, I don't have a current answer. So that, I hope that gives you some good insight.
The limit is 37,000 a year.
Yeah. So again, I mean, different people will give different answers. So go to the next slide. So again, for those that need personal care, it's often not included in job coaching, but it's counted as community aid, which means that if you have schedule changes, let's say you're in a professional job and for whatever reason you have to either, do more one day or 1 week because you have a task, a long-term task that's get done, the system doesn't accommodate those changes well. Next slide. So again, other barriers, transportation, and then losing Medicare or Medicaid can lead to unsustainable medical costs for someone with more intensive support needs. That was something, I know we're running out of time, so I'll just go through quickly with Adam. He had to spend a month and a half just trying to figure that part of it out, if he would lose Medicare or Medicaid or not. And as he said, it can be hard to find an answer. Even now with his, he doesn't know how many hours he can even work, for example. He has to negotiate that with his employer due to the resource limit. Next slide, please. So again, employers have to be very flexible. So the ADA and Section 504 are in place, but the minimal accommodations aren't enough. Simply providing the least doesn't work. They need to understand about pay and resource limits, and that can be a hard conversation to have because now you're taking somebody who's an employer and they have to be familiar with another system that's in play. Next slide. Again, they have to understand why schedule changes are difficult, and how that affects them. They need to understand how structural barriers impact their employees, and that's not easy for a lot of employers. That can be something that throws them off. Next slide, please.
And this is very important. I'm going to throw this in, Daniel, really quick.
Sure.
Like, our job for all four of us here requires us to travel. Well, the well, two of us require staff to go with us, and either our jobs or their jobs pay for them, so it comes out of our pocket to pay for the caregivers to come with us on trips.
And a lot of times the caregivers want 24-hour pay, which is not feasible.
Yeah.
Which is why in this you'll see an example of mental health because I just cannot financially afford that even with the assistance of the deliverer, that's why you have to have really good family, extended family, if you will, friends, whatever support.
So Adam was just, to summarize that, he was mentioning that with Phoenix is actually, you'll see an example where I'm going to be helping him because when he talked to some of the people about helping him, they said, well, we want 24-hour pay. In other words, they want to be paid for every single hour, even for sleeping. And it means that basically you can't find a lot of people for overnight care, so that becomes a barrier. So quickly about promotion, raises, or advancement, instead of working to get more money, people near the resource limit often have to take that into account when accepting a raise. Problem? Well, with promotion comes raises, so some people actually have to turn down promotions due to resource limits or lack of job assistance services, which is just backwards, but that's how it ends up working with some of the structural barriers. Next slide. And it limits advancement within a professional career, which can lead employees to feel stuck. It can reinforce second-class status among people with disabilities, and it can even discourage people from working altogether. So next slide, we're going to get into some of the attitudinal barriers as well. So the question is, how do negative attitudes show up in the workplace? Someone might not receive privileges that other people in the same position would get, including money, company benefits, control, or say in an organization. And a person can actually have work taken from them because they're not seen as capable. Next slide, and I'm going to have Amir give an example, but I just want to make sure to get through the slides.
And not to cut you off, but also, if you have a disability, you're not even trusted sometimes for things like a key. And maybe Daniel can help me to understand.
So one of the things that Adam was mentioning is that sometimes even something as simple as like having an office key will be something that if you have a disability, or let's say you have a more, especially if you have a more, let's say, obvious disability, they might not give you a key, whereas other employees might be given that. Other things, people will say not to be hard on someone because they have a disability. There will be an expectation of failure. In other words, that the employee just won't be able to do it. Employees with disabilities can be overlooked or ignored. Next slide, please. So employee or token, and then I'm going to let Amir or Adam talk just a little bit about their example. If you are paid attention to only when there is a public event or when you have to talk about your organization to others, but you're otherwise ignored, that's tokenism. So in other words, you're trotted out in front of the legislator, or you're trotted out at a, let's say an open house event, but otherwise you're just kind of, they don't really pay much attention to you. That's an example where maybe you're treated as a token. Token employees aren't seen as employees per se, but are seen as a way to make an organization look good. The organization sees employment with someone with disability as a feel-good story and thus has no real expectation to pass the job. So can we go to the next slide? But I'm going to let Amir and Adam jump in here to give examples of some of these attitudinal barriers that they've seen.
And actually, I'm not here to speak ill about my employer, but I've seen every piece of this, the last 3-4 slides in my situation currently,
and the current slide as well, which is how much responsibility will you be given. So some people are given less responsibility or given less power, which limits growth, and it keeps people from getting power within the organization. Is that something that applies to?
That does apply also tremendously. And really quick, because I know start on time is I applied for a specific position, and slowly but surely they are taking away duties and privileges that I'm supposed to have or should have, and it's not fair at all.
And then, Adam, you want to add something about this as well when it comes to employees with disabilities being treated differently? Because I know you've had some hard
What and don't misquote me. I don't mind being called a self-advocate at all. I'll embrace it all day long, all night long. But one thing I've experienced is when you're in a professional setting, people will say, and then I'm going to use you as an example, people will say, this is Daniel Aikman, the program manager for the Center for Self-Advocacy, and then when they get to me, because I'm assuming the severity of my disability, and I'll just be like, oh, he's a self-advocate, when in fact, yes, I am, but I also have a job title and a job that comes along with that, and I don't think people, not just myself or Cynthia, but I don't think people in general get the professional respect and courtesy that they deserve.
So that's a great example. In fact, there was another situation where he had actually had his title upgraded and changed, but there were some complaints from other employees in his organization because he was being called an analyst, and they didn't like the fact that he had that job title because they said, well, we're analysts. So again, that attitude of, well, why should this person be given the title that we have? So next slide. So undervalued, the very real effects of attitudinal barriers on people with disabilities. And this is something that, we're not going to go into examples, but we could talk about this a lot. It can lead people with disabilities to just leave the workforce and say, I've had enough, I don't want to work anymore, I don't want to be treated like this. It can lead to depression, anxiety, or other serious mental health issues among people with disabilities. It can even lead to feelings of worthlessness or self-confidence issues among people with disabilities. If you're treated badly and you internalize that, you can end up having very real issues, and it's something that I've worked with a lot of people actually that have had this problem. Next slide. So that's it for us. Is there anything, Amir or Adam, that you'd like to add before we go to questions?
Actually, I was, as far as pro Juliana, I think it's gonna be a lady named Mario that's gonna come on with Daniel, myself, and Amir and Cynthia. But I have to wait until tomorrow till we discuss it. But as soon as I know, I'll let you know who's gonna be coming on board with us.
Sounds great.
Okay.